men and women being tied together. So she is one of the world's greatest misogynists, of which there have been many, and are still many, around. And so she put down men. Now, but the women came and worshipped her up there in the Parthenon. Just as men, you might say, why? Because the concept of gods and goddesses back then is appeasement. You appease the god. You don't love the god. You might hate the god. In fact, many of the most famous gods are roundly hated. But you have to appease the god. How do you appease the god? You come to the temple, you make your offering, and you say nice things about the god in the temple. But this idea that you love God, God loves you, this is not Greek. Unless we're talking about Aphrodite, and then we're talking about sexual love, and that's another whole deal, right? No, the idea of agape love, of non-sexual love, of purest love, is Christian. I mean, it existed among the Greeks, but it wasn't popularized. It was really popularized Christianity. Christianity is the great movement of agape love. You love not because you're going to get anything out of it. You do love because love is the thing to do. That's what you do if you're a Christian. It's just your obligation. And it's a revolutionary idea. So when Paul comes down here and talks about agape love, they know what he's talking about. He uses the word agape. But he's promoting this idea that this is the centerpiece. And they're kind of confused because you don't love God, and you don't love your fellow man particularly. But what the Greeks were much more interested in what they call filio, which is brotherly love. So you have this relationship of filial love, but only mothers have agape, which the idea that only mothers are the ones that love without expecting anything in return, right? And that concept of love that Paul promotes takes root. And it's in the Greek world, in the Greek city-states, that Christianity flourishes. And then later, of course, Rome. Now, so the fundamental underlying foundation of, say, American democracy is the concept of citizenship, and that the citizens are the ones that choose the ruler. Now, think about American citizenship in the very early years. Who had the citizenship? Only white man, adults, had what?
Land.
Land, money, property. Voila, right? I mean, in other words, nothing essentially changes in terms of what democracy is. It's the expansion of the citizenry over first in England and in America, and then ultimately to all people. So we still have groups that aren't totally considered fully citizens, and this is one of the problems of American culture. But fundamentally, we've tried to include as many people. I would say in the last 200 and some years of the American experiment, trying to expand who can be a citizen. And it's really an important concept. Now I want to talk over here about the Temple of Dionysus. Now, Dionysus, of course, we know as the god of wine. Latin name Bacchus. So we'll see the great example of this in later this spring when we have the Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Mardi Gras, of course, is who is the head of Mardi Gras in New Orleans? Bacchus. And they call it Bacchanalian because people drink and get drunk and all of this kind of thing. But that's such a misunderstanding of Dionysus. Dionysus gave wine to mankind, but not to get drunk. In fact, hardly anybody in the ancient world ever got drunk. And you say, well, how do you know that? Simple. Wine is very expensive. You could get drunk, and people would do it, but they do it on purpose, and they do it so they could commune with Dionysus. But you can just go out and get drunk, unless you were an emperor and had, endless quantity of wine. But the average person, wine is medicine. Wine is what you take to make yourself feel better, to make yourself get through an abscessed tooth, a broken bone, something like it. In other words, wine was considered medicine, a gift from the god. And it's the only thing they had. I mean, you don't go to the cabinet and pick out Tylenol, right? We have so many, right? Aleve, Advil, I mean, you just go on and on, right? They didn't have that. What did they have? They had wine. So you're not feeling good, you got a headache, what do? You take wine. It's medicine. Now that distinction is really, really important. And so every year, at just about the time of Easter, which means around nearby March, just after March 21st, the vernal equinox, first full moon, which by the way is also Passover, and then tied to Easter. At the temple of Dionysus during this time, they put on plays. Now these plays, of course, were invented in the temple of Dionysus to tell stories. And these are stories that have a religious significance. Basically, shows you what happens to you if you don't believe in the gods, but most specifically in Dionysus. And some of these stories, of which we only have a relatively small number, about a dozen or so left from the thousands that were performed, but I guess they kept the best ones. And those famous plays, tragedies, all have to do with what happens to you if you don't believe in the gods. In other words, fire and brimstone tales that give you the message that you need to be devoted to these gods, because these gods have to be appeased. If the God isn't appeased, God's going to let you have it. And particularly if you go out of way to say something bad about the gods, you're toast. You are finished. And so these would be performed with men only, with masks on. So if they had a character of a woman, for example, they'd have a woman's mask, but men perform the role. Now the thing about these plays, it's kind of funny. It's kind of like us going to the Christmas pageant at church on Christmas Eve. And little children get up and they act out Joseph and Mary. We all know the story by heart. We know all the words of all the stories, right? Same. They knew the stories, but they went because they loved to see it, the spectacle. I know what's going to happen. Every note this afternoon at the boar's head, I know what they're going to do before they do it, and yet it's always new. It's always new, it's always fresh, and it's always exciting. The year we went to the first time to the boar's head by accident, we had been out at Crystal Cathedral, California. They had a big, spectacular show. And this show, flying angels everywhere, and not quite as good as Prestonwood, where they have Santas jumping out of the ceiling. That, I thought. But I went to Prestonwood once, and I thought, oh, that's really very colorful, very, very exciting. But I didn't need to go again, right? The Crystal Cathedral, Robert Schuller, it was beautiful in its way, but technologically very advanced. But it didn't move me. Didn't do anything to me. It didn't hit me. It didn't touch me in the soul. So that's what happened when I went to Boar's Head. It touched me. And that's when art can touch you, ladies and gentlemen, that is what it's supposed to do. but doesn't always do it, and unfortunately. So the Temple of Dionysus, every play, every musical, every drama you've seen in person or on television or in the movies goes back to the Temple of Dionysus. Now, then we come to this little temple down here, the Asclepion. Now, the Asclepion is named after Asclepius. Asclepius was the son of Apollo. Now, Apollo was the one you prayed to if you were sick until his son was born, and then Asclepius became the god of medicine. And you would go to the Asclepion if you were sick. In other words, think hospital here, think clinic, think therapy place or sanitarium, something like that, all right? Now, you go, Asclepius, and then Asclepius had two children. He had a number of children, but two children are very famous. One was named Hygeia, from which you get the word hygiene. So you see, they understood about the importance of purifying, keeping clean these places. And then the other child, Panacea. In other words, this idea that there's a cure, a pill, something you can take that's going to solve all of your problems. So this is a place where people would go for a variety of ailments. And here was the regime, if you can imagine it. They would go in, and the first thing they do would be purify. In other words, the hygiene part. They'd be cleaned, washed, and then, when that was over, they would be taken into a cubicle. Now, this is interesting. Our word incubation literally means in the cubicle. So they'd be in a small room, not very big, with a little pad on the floor. And you were to lay there. And then, when you laid there, you were supposed to go to sleep and have dreams. In fact, they gave you something to have dreams. What made this quite extraordinary to us is that the room would be filled up with snakes. And so the snakes are crossing over you and around you. They're non-poisonous snakes, but the snake, the idea is association of snakes with medicine, with healing. And so to this day, the sign of the American Medical Association is the rod of Asclepius with a snake, one like this, had a snake up here. And that is the sign. In other words, all of our medicine is derived from this. What's interesting to me is there was as much on psychological medicine as on physical medicine. Because what they did is when you woke up, then they would have a person there to write down what you said. And the idea was that the cure was in the dream. How revolutionary is that, Mr. Freud, Mr. Jung, right? Who thought they were coming up with something new and different. And so the Asclepion, then, was a place where you got your problems worked out. And, but in a sense, you cured yourself. And then they would send you off, and you would hopefully return to your normal routine. But if you got sick again, then you'd come back and do it all over again. Now, that's really amazing to me. There's also something up here that was all over this area called the Stoa, S-T-O-A. What it is, it's a walkway, covered walkway, from one building to another, from one area to another. It's called the Stoa. And people would sit in these, particularly if it was hot, to get in the shade. or if it was raining or even snowing, they would huddle inside here. And there were certain groups that came to the stoa. And no matter the weather, they would sit there and endure it and listen to their leader. And from which we get what word?
Stoic.
Stoic. So among the many Greek philosophical groups were the Stoics. And the Stoics believed that one should try to find the middle in life, not try to be insanely happy or insanely depressed, right? In other words, manic depressive condition to them was a bad thing. What they wanted you to do was to find the middle, so that you didn't react too much. If you had great good news, well, that's good. If you had great bad news, well, that's the way it goes. You know, that kind of thing. Kind of the Garrison Keillor approach to life, if you understand Garrison Keillor. Now, what's interesting, the Stoics, that philosophical group met here. Most of the philosophical groups did not meet here. They met at another place called the Academy. Academy. Now, what was the Academy? The Academy was out in the country where there were trees. You know how college campuses today are often set apart, they'll have lawns and trees and so on. That idea of the university was the idea of the philosophers, that they should do their contemplation away from the hubbub. See, this is the hubbub here. This is a lot of stuff going on here. So they're not far away, but they're in a grove of trees. So all of the famous ones, of course, Socrates, the most famous, then Plato, Aristotle, all of them had their places, or had their time, I should say, in the academy. But the academy wasn't so much a building, actually. Many of these groups would meet outside in the woods. But it became the gathering place. So if you went to Athens, you would go to the academy, and there you would study the philosophical ideas of whatever man that you was there teaching you. And so that's the foundation of a university and education. I mean, that's really our first higher education. So, to sum up, so many things, so many pieces of our culture are here. They start here. Now, I'm going to talk about, next week, when I talk about Alexandria, I'll take the last of the great philosophers, Aristotle, and then tie him into Alexandria. And we're going to see some very interesting things come out of Alexandria, and then ultimately all of it comes together in Rome. Rome is extraordinarily important, of course, for us, because although many of the ideas didn't come from Rome, Rome is the conduit that gets to us. Because American culture, ultimately comes back from the Roman. So, any comments or questions before we wrap this up today? Anybody want to ask anything about Athens? Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
If I'm understanding you right, you said Paul introduced agape love. Am I correct?
Well, agape was already a common idea among the Greeks. But what he did, they were surprised when he's talking about Christianity, this idea of a loving God. A loving God, where did that come from? See, they didn't get that. So the idea of agape, they understood what he was saying. They just couldn't believe they could put it at the center. That's really essentially what makes Christianity, from their point of view, unique. Yes, sir?
Where was the Lyceum in relation to these other places?
Okay, so the Lyceum is here, but not at this place. You know, Lyceum, the temple of the wolf god, was Apollo. It's controversial as to where it was, or in fact, if it existed as a physical building. This has been a big argument. Now, we'll talk about the Lyceum particularly next week. and then also into Rome. They had a Lyceum. But whether they had a physical Lyceum here is not known for sure. And I would say, I think it was really more important to the Romans, but I explained why it was so much more important to the Romans and why they had very prominent Lyceum. So we'll get to that if you're able to come on that third Sunday. Yes, Chris?
You mentioned concrete a little earlier. I don't know if that was just a way to describe stone.
Yeah.
Did they actually have the technology of concrete at that time?
No, and what happened, and I'll get into this the third Sunday when I talk about Rome. The Romans, of course, perfected concrete. Concrete was around in some ways, but they perfected concrete. And so what's amazing is what they built in concrete. A lot of it's still there. And that's 2,000 years ago, right? So, but most of what they built was stone.
And just those big, beautiful columns,
Yeah.
all just carved out. Is
All
that
carved
right?
out like a pie, and then they'd stack them up and so on. But ultimately, they would build in concrete and then make it look like, put stone on the outside, this kind of thing. We'll talk about this, we talk about the Pantheon, but the thing about the Romans is they're much more important to us as engineers and as innovators than they were as philosophers. But they basically built theirs on Greek philosophy. What's stunning, this whole period isn't much more than 50 years. The golden age of Athens, they only produced the great philosophers and the great writers and the great tragedies, all of this in just a short little period of time. That was all basically lost once they lost the Peloponnesian War with Sparta. And they never achieved anywhere near the prestige. They were so important. And by the way, the academy carried on for a long time, but Christianity couldn't have this, so this became a church for a long time. So they didn't allow the pagan religion to go on. Yeah.
So what year was this 50-year time period in history?
So it's 40, let's just say roundabout 450 to 400. I mean, just.
Okay. So is that before or after Alexander?
So Alexander then is he hits Egypt about 322, so about 100 years later.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I was just there this last summer,
Yeah.
and there was an area, it might have been the Stoa, but it was a city where they put all the pots together.
Oh, yeah.
And then right behind that was kind of the entryway that went up through to the city where all the cemeteries were at.
Ah, yes.
And it was very clear to me that the concept of an afterlife
Mm-hmm.
was very important there and bled over a little bit into Christianity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The stelas that they had
Mhm.
there were very great arts of work. And
Mhm.
they always showed the dying person sitting down, saying goodbye to
Mhm.
the people around them, and looking at those would tell a story about that person.
Mm. Amazing. Yeah, I'm not the first person to say this, of course, but it's always been a question of whether Christianity influences the pagan religions or the pagan religions influence Christianity more. What really happens, in my opinion, is a blending of the great theological foundations of Christianity. St. Augustine, in the beginning, it's all built on Plato, all of it. And then Aristotle, but mostly Plato. And so Western civilization comes out of all this, but again, the conduit is the Roman Catholic Church. So this is a good point you're making about, there's a lot of stuff going on besides what I'm talking about here. This was the center of their world. The city is all around it. And they are very hardworking, very ingenious people. But they're also very tied to their religious ideas. And so religion is very, very important to them. And many of those religious ideas then carry over into Christianity, into the Orthodox form of Christianity. Well, we'll continue this then, I hope, with many of you next Sunday. Thank you.